They say you should never meet your heroes because they will only disappoint you. But they don't tell you the rest of the warning. They don't tell you that your hero might look at you with eyes full of warmth, take your hand, promise to make all your dreams come true, and then methodically, surgically, steal the very soul out of your body. I didn't just meet my hero, I worked for him, I trusted him, I let him into the darkest corners of my mind, and he took notes, not to help me, but to replace me. And standing there in the rain outside the Royal Festival Hall in London, watching the banners unfurl with his face on them, I finally understood that the only way to get my voice back was to make sure he never spoke again. It started like a fairy tale. I was 24, living in a shoebox apartment in East London, working 2 barista jobs just to afford the time to write. Julian Blackwood was the literary god of our generation. He had written 3 masterpieces in the 90s and then nothing. Silence. He was the brooding genius, the recluse. When I saw the job posting for a personal archivist and assistant at his estate in Surrey, I applied as a joke. I didn't think a girl with a state school education and no connections had a chance, but I got the interview, and then I got the job. Moving into Blackwood Manor felt like stepping into a Gothic novel. The house was massive, filled with dust and shadows and books. Julian was charming. That's the first thing you have to understand about monsters like him. They don't look like monsters. He was funny, self-deprecating, and incredibly warm. He told me he was stuck, that the well had run dry, and he needed fresh energy in the house to organize his legacy. I wasn't just an assistant, I became his confidant. We would stay up late in his study, drinking wine, and he would tell me stories about the literary world, about the burden of genius. I felt seen. I felt special. For 2 years, I organized his life. I paid his bills, which is when I first noticed that the money was tight. He was spending faster than the royalties were coming in. I managed his emails. I even ghost wrote his responses to fan mail because he said he didn't have the emotional bandwidth. I didn't mind. I was practicing. I was writing in the voice of Julian Blackwood, but I was also writing my own story. It was a novel I had been working on since I was 16. It was called The Glass Aviary. It was deeply personal, based on my grandmother's escape from a cult in the 70s. It was raw, painful, and it was the best thing I had ever done. I kept it hidden, afraid it wasn't good enough. But one night, during a thunderstorm that rattled the old window panes of the study, Julian asked me what I was working on. He looked at me with those intense, fatherly eyes and said, "Alara, talent like yours suffocates in the dark. Let me see it. Let me help you." I hesitated. It felt like handing him my heart. But this was Julian Blackwood. If anyone could understand, it was him. I printed the manuscript, 340 pages, and placed it in his hands. He smiled, touched my shoulder, and said he would read it that night. The next morning, the house was quiet. I found him in the kitchen making coffee. He looked tired. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, for him to say something. He turned around, leaned against the counter, and sighed. "I read it, Alara," he said softly. "And?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head slowly. "It's sweet. It's a good effort, but it's derivative. The pacing is off, the characters feel flat, and honestly, the subject matter is a bit cliché. It's just not ready for the real world. You have a nice voice, but you're not a novelist. Maybe stick to short stories, or journaling." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I tried to hold back the tears, but they spilled over. He hugged me, patting my hair, telling me he was only being harsh because he cared, because he didn't want me to be embarrassed by publishing something subpar. I believed him. I went to my room and threw the digital file into the trash bin on my laptop. I shoved the physical copy into the back of my closet. I felt foolish. I felt small. 3 months later, Julian announced he had had a breakthrough. He locked himself in his study for weeks. He said the muse had finally returned. I was happy for him. I brought him food on trays, kept the house quiet, and fielded calls from his agent who was desperate for a new bestseller. Julian was manic, writing furiously. When he finally emerged, he looked triumphant. He popped a bottle of champagne and told me, "I've done it, Alara. I've written the book that will save me." He sent the manuscript off to his publisher immediately. He didn't let me read it. He said he was superstitious. Fast forward 6 months. The advance copies of The Cage Saint arrived at the manor. I remember the box sitting on the hallway table. Julian was out in London for a meeting. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box and took out a hardcover. The cover was beautiful, a shattered birdcage. A strange feeling of déjà vu washed over me. I opened the book to the first page. The rain didn't wash away the sins of the commune, it only made the mud deeper. My blood ran cold. That was my opening line. Not similar, exact. I sat on the floor of the hallway and read. I read the first chapter, then the second. I skimmed through the middle. I flipped to the end. It was my book. It was The Glass Aviary. He had changed the names. He had changed the setting from Scotland to Oregon. He had polished some of the dialogue, making it sound more Blackwoodian, more pretentious. But the structure, the plot twists, the specific anecdotes about my grandmother that nobody else could possibly know, it was all there. He had stolen my life. When Julian came home that evening, I was sitting in the living room, the book on my lap. I was shaking so hard I could barely speak. When he walked in, he saw the book, and for a split second, I saw a flash of fear in his eyes. But he covered it instantly with that charming, lazy smile. "Ah, you couldn't wait," he said, pouring himself a drink. "What do you think? It's a return to form, isn't it?" "It's my book," I whispered. He stopped pouring. He looked at me, his expression blank. "Excuse me?" "This is my book, Julian. You told me it was garbage. You told me to throw it away, and then you typed it up and put your name on it." He took a sip of his drink and laughed, a cold, dry laugh. "Ilara, don't be ridiculous. You're hysterical. This is a common theme. Cults, escape, trauma. It's in the zeitgeist. We talked about your little story, sure, and maybe some of that seeped into my subconscious. That's how inspiration works. We're writers. We share energy." "You used my grandmother's name for the cat," I screamed, standing up. "You used the story about the red ribbon. That happened to me." His face hardened. The mask dropped. "And who are they going to believe? Me, Julian Blackwood, literary icon, or you, the failed assistant with a history of anxiety and no publishing credits?" He stepped closer, looming over me. "If you say a word about this, Alara, I will destroy you. I will paint you as a stalker, an obsessed fan who tried to claim my work. I have the lawyers, I have the press. You have nothing." He was right. I had nothing. I packed my bags that night and left. He didn't even watch me go. For the next few weeks, I lived on my friend Toby's couch. Toby was an audio engineer, a cynic, and the only person who believed me without question. I spent my days crying and my nights obsessively checking Julian's social media. The reviews were glowing. "A masterpiece," the Times said. "Blackwood's triumphant return." Every compliment felt like a knife in my chest. He was on talk shows, looking humble, talking about how the story came to him in a fever dream. I wanted to sue him. I met with a lawyer who worked pro bono. He asked for proof. "Do you have the original file?" he asked. I checked my laptop. The file was gone. Not just in the trash bin, wiped. Julian must have accessed my computer while I was sleeping or out running errands. "Do you have emails where you sent it to him?" No, I had printed it. "Do you have the physical copy?" I had left it at the manor in my panic. I had nothing. No paper trail. Just my word against a giant. I fell into a deep depression. I watched him win an award. I watched him sign a movie deal. He was getting richer and more famous off the pain of my family. But grief, eventually, turns into something else. If you let it sit long enough, it curdles into rage. And rage is fuel. I realized that fighting him legally was impossible. He had the money and the narrative. I had to fight him creatively. I had to use his own arrogance against him. I knew Julian better than anyone. I knew his secrets. I knew he was technically illiterate. I knew he didn't read his contracts. And I knew that The Caged Saint was the first book of a two-book deal. He had sold the sequel on the pitch alone. But here was the problem. He didn't write the first one. I did, which meant he had no idea how to write the second one. I waited. 6 months passed. The hype for the first book was dying down, and the publisher started asking about the sequel. I monitored his interviews. He looked tired again. He looked stressed. He was dodging questions about the plot of the next book. I created a fake email address. Ghost Protocol. I sent a message to his private encrypted email, the one only his accountant and I knew. Subject: I know you're stuck. Body: you can't write the sequel because you didn't write the original. The walls are closing in, Julian. The deadline is coming. I can help. I don't want credit. I just want money. I have the draft for part 2. It matches the voice perfectly because, well, you know why. I waited. It was a gamble. But I knew he was lazy, and I knew he was terrified of being exposed as a fraud. He replied 3 hours later, "Who is this?" I replied, "Does it matter? I'm the solution to your problem. Meet me in the chat room linked below." I didn't reveal it was me. I let him assume I was a hacker or just an opportunist. We negotiated. He was desperate. He agreed to pay me £50,000 for the manuscript of the sequel, provided he got to read it first, and I signed a terrifying NDA. I agreed. I spent the next 2 months writing the sequel to my own stolen book. It was agonizing, but it was also part of the trap. I wrote a brilliant book. It was compelling, sharp, and perfectly aligned with the first one. But I wove something into the text. Not a hidden code, nothing that obvious. I built the plot around a character who is a fraud, a man who steals a life and is slowly driven mad by a sound only he can hear. It was subtle, psychological horror. Julian loved it. He was too narcissistically blind to see that the character was a caricature of himself. He just saw a good story that would keep the checks coming. He wired the money to an offshore account I set up with Toby's help. He took the manuscript. He announced the release of The Silenced Song. But that wasn't the revenge. That was just the bait. The real revenge was the audiobook. Julian insisted on narrating his own audiobooks. He had that rich, baritone voice that fans loved. He claimed it added authenticity. The recording sessions were scheduled at a high-end studio in Soho. I knew the schedule, and thanks to Toby, who called in a favor from a guy who worked at that specific studio, we had access to the system. We weren't going to sabotage the audio quality. We were going to sabotage the teleprompter. Julian didn't read from a physical book when recording. He read from a digital tablet in the booth, scrolling the text. He was known for doing cold reads. He never practiced beforehand because he was too arrogant. He believed he could perform it perfectly on the first take. The day of the recording arrived. I was sitting in a van outside the studio with Toby, watching a remote feed of the control room. Julian walked in, looking like a king. He joked with the sound engineer, drank his herbal tea, and stepped into the booth. He put on the headphones. "Ready when you are, lads," he said. The recording began. He read the first chapter beautifully. It was my words, flowing out of his mouth. It made me sick, but I held on. We waited until he was deep into the session. Chapter 12. The emotional climax of the book. The moment the protagonist confesses his sins to his dying mother. Toby's fingers flew across his keyboard. "Injecting the override now," he whispered. In the booth, the text on Julian's tablet shifted. It was seamless. The font, the spacing, it looked exactly the same. But the words were no longer the novel I had sent him. They were words I had written specifically for this moment. Julian was in a rhythm. He was acting, his eyes half closed, feeling the performance. He read aloud. I looked at her, and the truth clawed its way up my throat. I told her, He paused for a dramatic effect, then continued reading the text scrolling before him. I told her that I am a hollow man, that I have never had an original thought in my life. I told her that Alara Vance wrote every word I have claimed for the last year. I told her that I stole the soul of a young woman because I was too cowardly to face my own irrelevance. Julian stopped. He blinked. He looked closely at the screen. But the words kept scrolling, and because he was in the flow, because his brain was on autopilot, he had actually read the first half of that sentence before his conscious mind caught up. "What is this?" he muttered into the microphone. "The script is wrong." But we weren't just changing the script. We were live streaming. We had hacked the studio's listen-in link, a feature usually reserved for publishers to listen remotely. But Toby had redirected that stream to Julian's own Twitter account and Instagram Live, titled Exclusive Live Reading of the Silenced Song. 200,000 people were listening. "I didn't write this," Julian snapped, getting angry. "Who changed the text?" Then Toby hit the second macro. Audio began to play inside the booth, blasting through Julian's headphones so he couldn't ignore it. It was a recording I had made months ago on my phone, the night he got drunk and bragged about how easy it was to manipulate the industry. Voice of Julian, recording. "These kids, they're desperate, Alara. You take their little ideas, you put a glossy cover on them, and they should be thanking you. I'm doing them a favor. Nobody wants to read a book by a nobody. They want Julian Blackwood. I am the brand. The writing is just filler." In the booth, Julian's face went pale. He ripped the headphones off. "Turn it off! Cut the feed!" he screamed. But the feed was live, and the world heard him screaming. They heard the recording of him admitting to the theft. They heard him panic. "It's a deep fake," he yelled at the sound engineer, who was looking at him with horror. "Someone hacked the system." But then came the final nail. I had programmed the teleprompter to display one final image. It wasn't text, it was a photo of the original manuscript of The Glass Aviary, sitting on his desk, with his handwriting in the margins that said, "Change names, keep plot, discard the girl." He had forgotten I took that photo the day I found the book. It was the only proof I had, but without the context, it was useless. Now, with the audio confession and the live meltdown, it was the smoking gun. Julian stared at the screen in the booth. He knew. He knew everyone could see it because the studio monitors were mirroring the feed. He slumped into the chair. The arrogance evaporated. He looked like an old, scared man. I signaled Toby to cut the feed. We sat in the van in silence for a moment. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "You okay?" Toby asked. I looked at the studio door. Security was running in. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." The fallout was fast and brutal. The publisher dropped him within 24 hours. They announced an immediate investigation. The internet detectives went to work analyzing The Caged Saint and finding the inconsistencies that proved it wasn't his style. The advance for the sequel was clawed back. He was sued by the production company for the movie rights. Julian Blackwood didn't go to prison, but he went to a place much worse for a narcissist. Obscurity. He was pariah. He had to sell the manor to pay his legal fees. The last I heard, he was living in a small flat in Innocent, trying to self-publish under a pseudonym, but the internet always found him and review-bombed him into oblivion. As for me, I didn't want the money. I didn't even want the fame of being the real author of his hit. I wanted a clean slate. I took the £50,000 he had paid me for the sequel, money that was legally mine for ghostwriting services, and I traveled. I went to the places my grandmother had told me about. I breathed, I healed, and then I started writing again. Not under a pseudonym, not for a man who wanted to steal my light. I wrote under my own name. 2 years later, I walked into a bookstore. On the new releases table, right at the front, was a book. The Aviary Unlocked by Alara Vance. It wasn't the book he stole. It was better. It was the story of a girl who built a glass castle for a king, only to realize the king was naked and the glass was sharp enough to cut him down. I watched a young woman pick it up. She read the first page, smiled, and tucked it under her arm. I walked out into the sunshine. I had my voice back, and this time nobody was ever going to silence it.